During our engagement party, my phone slid off the table. When I bent down, I saw my fiancé's hand on someone else's knee. I looked up. It was my best friend. He smiled and said, "Relax. It's not what you think." The engagement party was supposed to be the easy part. The hard part was meant to come later, with seating charts, venue contracts, and endless arguments about colors that no one would remember. This night was just noise, laughter, and people telling us we looked perfect together. It was hosted in a private room of a downtown restaurant, the kind with warm lighting and tables pushed too close together. My parents were already tipsy. Her parents were taking photos of everything, including things that did not need to be photographed. My fiancée, Elena, sat to my right. She kept her hand on my arm when people came over, squeezing slightly each time someone congratulated us. It looked natural. It looked convincing. Across from us sat Wesley, my best friend since college. He had helped plan the party. He had given a short toast earlier that landed well with everyone. People laughed. I laughed too, because that was expected. The table was crowded with plates, glasses, and phones stacked wherever there was space. Conversations overlapped. Someone kept bumping my chair when they stood up to greet someone else. It was chaotic in the harmless way celebrations usually are. At some point, my phone vibrated. I picked it up, checked the screen, and set it back down near the edge of the table. I remember thinking I should move it further in, but I did not. A minute later, someone reached across the table for a drink and knocked it off. The phone slid off cleanly, not bouncing, not catching on anything. It disappeared under the table between my chair and Elena's. I leaned down without thinking. It was automatic, muscle memory. As I bent forward, my eyes adjusted to the dimmer light under the table, and that was when I saw it. Elena's hand was not on my leg. Her hand was on someone else's knee. The angle made it impossible to misinterpret. Her fingers were resting flat, relaxed, with the kind of familiarity that only comes from repetition. The knee was close to hers, angled inward. The pants were dark. The leg was unmistakably Wesley's. For half a second, my brain tried to correct the image. It told me this was an accident, that the table was cramped, that people shifted constantly. That explanation collapsed almost immediately because her hand did not move when I froze. It stayed exactly where it was. I straightened up slowly. Wesley was already looking at me. He did not pull his leg back. He did not move his hands. He met my eyes with a calm expression that did not belong in the moment. Then he smiled, just slightly, and spoke in a tone that was almost amused. He told me to relax, and said it was not what I thought. He said it casually, as if he were correcting me about the time or the menu. Elena reacted a second later. Her hand slid away, but there was no panic in her face. She looked at me, then at Wesley, then back at me. Her expression shifted into something careful and controlled. She asked if everything was okay, loud enough for the people near us to hear. The people around us kept talking. No one noticed. No one stopped. I picked up my phone and placed it back on the table. My hands felt steady, which surprised me. I sat down again, adjusted my chair, and nodded once. I said yes, everything was fine. That was the first lie of the night, and it was mine. For the next hour, I stayed in my seat and watched. Once I knew what to look for, it was impossible not to see it. Elena and Wesley did not touch again openly, but they communicated constantly. Glances lasted half a second too long. Smiles appeared at moments that had nothing to do with the conversation. When someone stood between them, there was a brief flash of irritation on both their faces. I realized then that this was not new. This was practiced. I started replaying memories without meaning to. Times when Wesley had shown up unexpectedly. Times when Elena mentioned he had stopped by to talk while I was working late. Jokes they shared that I did not understand. The way conversations stopped when I entered a room, then resumed after I left. None of those moments had felt important on their own. Together, they formed a pattern that I could no longer ignore. At one point, Elena leaned toward me and asked if I wanted another drink. Her voice was soft. Her hand touched my arm again, exactly where it always did. The gesture felt rehearsed now, like part of a role she knew how to play well. I told her I was fine. Wesley stood up later to take a call. As he passed behind Elena, his hand brushed her shoulder. It was subtle. Anyone else would have missed it. She did not flinch. I did not confront either of them then. Not because I was unsure, but because the setting mattered. The room was full of people who did not deserve to be dragged into it yet. I also wanted to see how far they would go if they thought I had accepted the explanation. They went further than I expected. When the cake was brought out, Wesley positioned himself beside Elena for photos. When someone suggested a group picture, he put his arm behind her chair. His hand rested there casually, as if it belonged. Elena did not correct it. I smiled for the camera. I noticed something else too. Wesley spoke to Elena differently than he spoke to anyone else. There was a familiarity in his tone, a confidence that assumed access. He finished her sentences. He anticipated her reactions. When she laughed, He reacted before the joke landed. That kind of synchronization does not happen overnight. By the time the party began winding down, I no longer felt shocked. The shock had burned off quickly, replaced by a heavy clarity that settled in my chest. I was not dealing with a misunderstanding. I was dealing with a relationship that had been hiding in plain sight. As guests began leaving, Elena stayed close to me. Too close. She kept asking if I was tired, if I wanted to head home soon. Her eyes searched my face constantly, checking for cracks. Wesley avoided me entirely for the last half hour. That avoidance said more than anything else he had done. When we finally left, Elena reached for my hand in the car. I let her take it. Her grip tightened, as if she were bracing for impact. I said nothing on the drive. At home, she went straight to the kitchen, talking about how exhausting the night had been. She mentioned Wesley once, casually, saying he had really come through with the planning. She waited for my reaction. I gave her none. When she finally asked what was wrong, her voice was careful. She did not sound confused. She sounded prepared. I told her we would talk later. I said it evenly, without raising my voice. That unsettled her more than anger would have. That night, lying awake beside her, I understood something important. Whatever was happening between Elena and Wesley had been happening long enough for them to believe they could manage it. Wesley's reaction under the table had not been fear. It had been confidence. Confidence comes from success. As I stared at the ceiling, I stopped thinking about what I had lost and started thinking about what they believed they could take from me without consequence. That was the moment the engagement party ended for me, even though the ring was still on her finger and the photos were already being shared online. Morning came too quickly. I had not slept, but Elena had. That alone told me more than any explanation could. She woke up calm, stretched, and asked if I wanted coffee, as if the night before had ended normally. Her voice carried the same softness she used when she wanted to slow things down, when she wanted control without force. I told her we needed to talk. She did not ask about what. She just nodded. We sat at the kitchen table. I stayed standing. That detail mattered to me. I needed distance, not comfort. I told her exactly what I had seen under the table. I did not dramatize it. I described the placement of her hand, the angle of Wesley's leg, and the way neither of them reacted with surprise. Elena listened without interrupting. When I finished, she exhaled slowly and leaned back in her chair. Her expression was not guilt. It was calculation. She said it had been a misunderstanding, not accidental contact, but something closer to emotional closeness that had crossed a line without intention. She framed it as comfort, familiarity, history. She talked about stress, about wedding pressure, about needing someone who understood her without questions. She did not deny the contact. That was the first thing that made my chest tighten. I asked her why Wesley. Of all people, why him? She said he had been there for her in ways I had not noticed. She said it had never been physical in a real sense. She said nothing had happened that could not be undone. I asked her why she had not pulled her hand away. She did not answer that directly. Instead, she asked why I had waited until morning to bring it up. That was when I realized she was not afraid of what I knew. She was afraid of how I would act. I told her I wanted to hear it from Wesley himself. I said that calmly, without challenge. That changed her posture immediately. She straightened in her chair and asked if that was really necessary. She suggested handling it privately, between us. I told her I had already handled private trust, and it had not gone well. She texted Wesley while sitting in front of me. She did not hide the screen, but she angled it slightly away. I did not ask to see the message. I did not need to. Wesley arrived less than an hour later. He walked in like he owned the space. No hesitation, no uncertainty. He greeted Elena first, asked if she was okay, then finally looked at me. He sat down without being invited. I told him to explain what I had seen. He leaned back and said it was being blown out of proportion. He said Elena had been overwhelmed and needed reassurance. He said he had stepped in because he cared about both of us. He framed himself as a stabilizing force, not a disruptor. I asked him why his knee had been under the table close enough for her hand to rest there naturally. He said tables were small. I asked him why he smiled at me instead of pulling away. He said he had not wanted to embarrass anyone. I asked him why he had avoided me for the rest of the party. That question finally landed. Wesley shifted in his seat. He said he had sensed tension and thought giving me space was respectful. He spoke like someone used to talking his way out of situations, choosing words carefully while pretending not to care. Elena watched both of us, eyes moving back and forth. She did not intervene. That silence told me everything. I told them both something simple. I said trust does not break in one moment. It erodes through permission. I said whatever they thought this was, it had crossed into betrayal long before I saw it. Wesley laughed under his breath. Not loudly, not mockingly, but dismissively. He said I was letting insecurity ruin years of friendship and a future marriage. He said I should take responsibility for my reactions instead of assigning blame. That was the moment the conversation stopped being about explanation. I told Wesley to leave. He looked at Elena. She hesitated. That hesitation lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Wesley stood, smoothed his jacket, and said we would talk later when emotions were under control. I told him there would be no later. After he left, Elena finally broke down, but it was not panic. It was frustration. She accused me of humiliating her by involving him directly. She said I was forcing her to choose sides unnecessarily. I told her she had already chosen. She said that was unfair. She said relationships were complicated and that people made mistakes. She said calling off the engagement over something that had not gone all the way was extreme. I asked her how far it had gone. She hesitated again, this time longer. She said she did not know how to define that. I told her I could. I said intimacy does not start with bodies. It starts with permission. I said she had given Wesley access that belonged inside our relationship. I said the physical part was just the visible layer. She cried then, but the tears came without surrender. She cried because things were slipping beyond her control, not because she regretted what she had done. I told her the engagement was paused. I did not say canceled. I chose that word deliberately. It created uncertainty without resolution. I asked for the ring back temporarily. She refused at first, then handed it over with shaking hands. That afternoon, I made calls. I told my parents the engagement was on hold due to dishonesty. I did not give details. I let the word do the work. I told her parents the same thing. They were confused and concerned, but they listened. Elena panicked when she realized I was not containing the situation. She asked me not to tell people yet. She said we needed time to sort things out privately. I told her privacy had already been abused. By evening, messages started coming in. Friends asking if everything was okay. Wesley texting me to talk, to clear misunderstandings, to salvage things. I did not respond. What I did instead was think. I thought about how easily they had dismissed what I saw, how confident Wesley had been, how Elena had spoken as if forgiveness were a procedural step rather than a choice. That confidence meant something. It meant this was not the first boundary they had crossed. It meant they had tested limits before and faced no consequences. Late that night, Elena told me she was going to stay with a friend for a few days. She said space would help. I agreed without hesitation. After she left, I walked through the apartment and noticed things I had ignored before. Wesley's jacket hanging in the closet from some forgotten visit. His mug in the dishwasher. A familiarity that no longer felt innocent. I sat down and made a decision that would shape everything that followed. I was not going to argue anymore. I was not going to convince them. I was going to let reality catch up to the story they had been telling themselves. By the time I went to bed, I knew this was no longer about saving an engagement. It was about exposing a pattern that depended on silence. And silence was no longer available to them. The first thing that changed was the tone of the questions. They stopped being polite check-ins and started sounding like audits. People were not asking how we were doing anymore. They were asking what had happened. Not because I volunteered details, but because Elena and Wesley could not keep their versions aligned. I stayed quiet on purpose. Silence creates space, and space invites people to fill it. Elena filled it with reassurance that we were working through stress. Wesley filled it with vague statements about misunderstandings and emotions running high. Neither of them expected those explanations to be compared. They were. My parents called first. They wanted clarity. I told them exactly what I had seen and how it had been handled afterward. I did not editorialize. I did not exaggerate. I described behavior and reactions. My mother went quiet. My father asked one question and then ended the call. Elena's parents reacted differently. They pushed back at first. They asked if I was sure. They suggested fatigue and alcohol. When I explained that neither denial nor apology had followed, their concern shifted. They stopped defending and started asking Elena questions she had not prepared answers for. Wesley made a mistake 2 days later. He hosted a small gathering at his place, framing it as a chance to reset the group and avoid rumors. He invited mutual friends, including people from work. Elena was there. I was not. That absence became conspicuous. Someone asked why I was not there. Someone else mentioned that I had put the engagement on hold. A third person asked Elena directly what had happened at the party. She gave a version that minimized physical contact and emphasized emotional confusion. Wesley added commentary that framed me as overwhelmed and reactive. Then someone mentioned the hand under the table. The room went quiet. No one accused them. No one raised voices. People simply asked follow-up questions. The answers did not line up. Wesley interrupted Elena twice. Elena corrected him once. That single moment told the room everything it needed to know. By the next morning, I started receiving messages from people who had been there. They did not ask for permission to tell me what they had noticed. They felt compelled to clarify their own distance from the situation. That is how reputations crack. Not with confrontation, but with disassociation. Wesley's workplace noticed the shift first. He had built his position on reliability and discretion. That reputation relied on trust. When coworkers heard he had crossed boundaries at a public engagement party, it raised questions about judgment. When those same coworkers realized the story kept changing, trust eroded quickly. He did not lose his job immediately. He lost something worse. He lost momentum. Projects were reassigned. Leadership roles quietly moved to someone else. Invitations slowed. Elena's situation unraveled faster. Her parents had been financially involved in the wedding planning. Deposits were paused. Vendors started asking questions. When Elena tried to reassure them without giving details, they asked me directly. I answered honestly. They stopped funding the wedding the same day. That decision triggered panic. Elena called repeatedly. She wanted to talk. She wanted to clarify. She wanted to reframe. I told her we could talk later, but not to revise the past. That was the boundary she could not cross anymore. She tried a different angle. She told people I had pressured her, emotionally and otherwise. She implied control issues without stating them outright. That tactic worked briefly, until people compared notes. The pattern did not fit. The timeline did not align. The accusations lacked specifics. When confronted with inconsistencies, Elena withdrew. Wesley reacted by escalating. He contacted my parents directly, positioning himself as a concerned friend trying to repair damage. That backfired immediately. My parents did not engage. They informed me, then cut contact. That rejection unsettled him. He sent messages asking to meet, to talk, to resolve things privately. I declined without explanation. At that point, the engagement was no longer the central issue. The issue was credibility. I attended a mutual friend's birthday dinner a week later. Elena and Wesley were not there. Their absence was noticeable. People spoke carefully at first, then more freely. I did not steer the conversation. I answered questions when asked and stayed factual. Someone mentioned that Wesley had been unusually present in Elena's life even before the engagement. Someone else recalled moments that felt off but had been dismissed. These realizations did not feel like gossip. They felt like recalibration. Elena tried one last public maneuver. She posted a message online about growth, boundaries, and learning from mistakes. It was vague enough to avoid accountability, but pointed enough to suggest shared blame. The comments did not go the way she expected. People asked what had been learned. People asked who had crossed boundaries. People asked why no apology had been made to me. The post was deleted within hours. Wesley's partner learned the truth that same week. She reached out to me, not for details, but for confirmation. I told her what I knew and when I had learned it. She thanked me and ended the conversation. She moved out 2 days later. That departure accelerated everything. Wesley stopped trying to manage optics and started blaming Elena. Elena blamed stress. Stress blamed timing. Timing blamed misunderstandings. None of it held. By the end of the week, the engagement was functionally over even though no formal announcement had been made. The ring remained with me. The apartment was quiet. The future we had planned no longer felt like something I needed to mourn. What surprised me most was how quickly people adjusted. They did not need drama to understand what had happened. They needed coherence. Once they saw the pattern, they moved on. That movement carried consequences with it. Elena asked to meet one final time. She wanted closure. She wanted to explain herself without interruption. I agreed to a public setting during the day. She arrived composed and prepared. She spoke about mistakes, confusion, and pressure. She asked for forgiveness without stating what she was asking forgiveness for. I told her the truth calmly. I said forgiveness requires accountability. I said trust does not survive revision. I said the damage was not a single action, but a series of choices protected by entitlement. She asked if I was really willing to throw everything away over one moment under a table. I told her it was never one moment. She left without argument. That evening, I formally canceled the engagement. I notified vendors. I closed joint accounts. I documented the separation cleanly and legally. There were no scenes and no ultimatums. The fallout continued without my involvement. Wesley's professional trajectory stalled permanently. Elena lost her family's financial support. Their connection, once hidden and exciting, became public and burdensome. They were left with each other and the knowledge that neither had protected the other when consequences arrived. I slept well for the first time in weeks. The story had broken, not because I exposed it aggressively, but because it could not survive contact with reality. The engagement ended quietly on paper and loudly everywhere else. Once the formal notices went out, the remaining pieces began to fall with their own weight. Vendors refunded what they could and charged penalties where contracts required it. Deposits were forfeited. Guest lists were archived. Plans that had once felt permanent were reduced to invoices and confirmations. Elena tried to negotiate those losses by herself. Without her parents backing her financially, she discovered how little leverage she actually had. She asked me more than once if we could split some of the costs evenly, framing it as fairness. I declined. I had not created the instability that collapsed the wedding. I had simply refused to absorb it. That refusal forced her to confront consequences she had assumed would be shared automatically. Wesley faced a different reckoning. His workplace never accused him of anything directly. They did not need to. He was removed from a leadership track under the explanation of restructuring. Projects he once managed were reassigned to people with quieter reputations. Performance reviews referenced judgment and discretion without naming incidents. The effect was unmistakable. He reached out again, this time without posture or confidence. He asked to meet, saying he wanted to clear the air and apologize properly. I declined again. Apologies do not repair systems that depend on denial. Elena moved out of the apartment within 2 weeks. She took only what she needed and left behind things she could not easily explain owning. When she returned for the last box, she lingered longer than necessary, waiting for something to shift. Nothing did. She tried to reframe the narrative one last time, telling people that the engagement had ended due to incompatibility discovered too late. That explanation might have held if she had not already burned trust everywhere else. People nodded politely and did not ask follow-up questions. That silence was not forgiveness. It was disengagement. Her parents reduced contact to logistics. Financial support stopped entirely. The independence she had once spoken about confidently now came with urgency. She took on extra work and canceled plans that relied on assumptions she no longer had the luxury to make. Wesley attempted to repair his image by aligning publicly with Elena. He attended events with her, posted carefully curated photos, and spoke about resilience. The effort backfired. People did not see a recovery story. They saw two individuals clinging to a version of events that no longer convinced anyone. Their relationship, once hidden and protected by secrecy, became strained under visibility. Without discretion, it lost its appeal. Without novelty, it exposed incompatibilities they had ignored. They separated less than 3 months later. By then, I had already moved on in practical ways. I relocated to a different neighborhood, closer to work and further from shared routines. I replaced furniture that carried unnecessary memories. I closed accounts that no longer served a purpose. What I did not do was make announcements or seek validation. People noticed anyway. The absence of chaos where it had been expected unsettled some and reassured others. Friends adjusted their understanding of me quietly. New conversations replaced old ones. Invitations returned without awkwardness. The most significant consequence was not social or financial. It was structural. Elena had believed that emotional access could be redistributed without cost. Wesley had believed that loyalty could be bent without breaking. Both had relied on my silence to maintain that belief. Once that silence ended, the system collapsed. Months later, I ran into Wesley unexpectedly at a professional event. He looked thinner and less certain. He avoided eye contact. We did not speak. That distance was enough. I heard later that he had changed roles and cities, framing it as a fresh start. Fresh starts require acknowledgement of what ended. Without that, they are relocations, not resolutions. Elena sent one final message near the end of the year. She wrote about reflection and accountability in abstract terms. She asked how I was doing. I did not respond. That decision was not rooted in bitterness. It was rooted in closure. The engagement party photo still circulates online occasionally, resurfacing in automated reminders. I do not delete it. It represents a moment before clarity, not because it was false, but because it was incomplete. The truth arrived later, under a table, in a space no one else was looking. That truth reshaped lives. Mine stabilized. Theirs recalibrated under pressure they had not planned for. Consequences rarely arrive with drama. They arrive with adjustments that become permanent. That was how this ended.